In June of 1815, a man who had once commanded an empire made a choice that would trap him forever. Napoleon Bonaparte returned to power after exile, raised an army, and marched north toward Belgium. He believed he understood what was coming. He believed he could break his enemies before they gathered. He believed speed and audacity would carry him through one more campaign. He was wrong about all three. The mistake was not Waterloo itself. The mistake was believing he still had time. After escaping Elba in March, Napoleon had barely 3 months to rebuild France's military strength. His marshals were exhausted. His veterans were scattered. The coalition forming against him included Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and half a dozen smaller powers. They were raising over 700,000 soldiers. Napoleon had perhaps 280,000, and many of those were untested conscripts or men who had already lost faith in his judgment. The rational choice would have been to defend, to fortify France's borders, to negotiate, to buy time. Napoleon rejected all of it. He chose offense. He chose Belgium. He chose to believe that one decisive victory could shatter the coalition before it fully mobilized. It was the same instinct that had carried him to power. It was also the instinct that would end him. His plan relied on moving faster than his enemies expected. He would cross into Belgium, split the British and Prussian armies, and destroy them separately before they could coordinate. On paper, it was sound. Wellington commanded roughly 68,000 troops near Brussels. Blücher led about 120,000 Prussians to the east. If Napoleon could drive between them with 120,000 men of his own, he could force each army to fight alone. Speed was everything. Surprise was everything. And for the first 2 days, it worked. On June 15th, Napoleon's forces crossed the frontier faster than Wellington or Blücher anticipated. The French pushed north, seized crossroads, and began splitting the Allied line. Wellington was caught off guard. Blücher scrambled to reposition. For a brief moment, Napoleon had the advantage he needed. Trust in their alliance. When the French attacked, Wellington did not retreat to the sea. He fell back to a ridge near Waterloo and waited. Blücher did not abandon him. He regrouped after a brutal engagement at Ligny and prepared to march west. The coalition held. Napoleon's window closed. On June 17th, rain began to fall. It turned the roads into mud. It delayed Napoleon's pursuit. It gave Wellington time to position his forces along a low ridge south of Waterloo. It gave Blücher time to rally his bruised divisions. The weather was not part of anyone's strategy. It simply happened. And it mattered more than almost any decision made that week. By the morning of June 18th, Napoleon faced a choice. He could wait for the ground to dry, giving his artillery better footing but also giving the Prussians more time to arrive. Or he could attack immediately, accepting worse conditions but hoping to overwhelm Wellington before help came. He waited. He delayed the assault until nearly noon. He believed the Prussians were too far away and too battered to intervene. He believed his artillery needed dry ground to be effective. He believed Wellington's position was vulnerable. All three beliefs were incorrect. 30 in the morning. French guns opened fire on Wellington's ridge. Infantry columns advanced through the mud. Cavalry charged up the slope. Wellington's line held. The British infantry formed squares to resist the French horsemen. The artillery tore holes in Napoleon's columns. Hours passed. The fighting was brutal and inconclusive. And then, in the early afternoon, Prussian scouts appeared on the eastern horizon. Blucher's advance guard was arriving. Napoleon had miscalculated their distance. He had underestimated their willingness to march through exhaustion. He had assumed they would need another day. They did not. He was forced to split his reserves, sending troops east to slow the Prussian approach while still trying to break Wellington's center. His army was now fighting on two fronts. The plan was collapsing. Napoleon made one final attempt. He ordered the Imperial Guard, his most elite infantry, to assault Wellington's ridge in the late afternoon. These were veterans who had never been broken. If anyone could shatter the British line, it was them. They marched uphill in tight columns through smoke and cannon fire. Wellington's infantry waited behind the crest, hidden from view. When the guard reached the top, the British stood and fired at point-blank range. The volley was devastating. The guard faltered. They tried to reform. The British fired again. The guard began to retreat. It was the first time in Napoleon's career that the Imperial Guard had been repulsed in a frontal assault. The psychological effect was immediate. Across the battlefield, French soldiers saw the guard falling back. Panic spread. Units began to dissolve. Wellington ordered a general advance. The British and Allied forces surged forward. The Prussians pushed harder from the east. Napoleon's army shattered. He tried to rally his men near a farmhouse called La Belle Alliance. It was useless. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and ran. Napoleon himself narrowly avoided capture. He rode south through the night, chased by Prussian cavalry. By dawn, his army had ceased to exist as a coherent force. The campaign he believed would restore his empire had lasted exactly 4 days. Waterloo was not a close battle. It was a collapse. And the collapse began long before the first shot was fired. The mistake was not tactical. Napoleon had fought brilliantly in worse conditions. The mistake was strategic. He had chosen to gamble everything on a single campaign when he no longer had the resources to sustain a gamble. He had assumed his reputation alone would be enough to demoralize his enemies. He had believed speed could replace strength. He had ignored the possibility that his opponents had learned from 20 years of fighting him. Wellington and Blucher did not panic. They did not break. They adapted. And Napoleon, for the first time, could not recover from adaptation. After Waterloo, there was no second chance. The coalition closed in. Napoleon fled to Paris, abdicated again, and tried to escape to America. He was captured by the British and exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. He would spend the last 6 years of his life there, dictating memoirs and blaming others for his defeat. He never fully accepted that the mistake was his. He blamed the rain. He blamed his marshals. He blamed Blucher's unexpected arrival. He never acknowledged that the entire campaign rested on assumptions that no longer matched reality. His enemies were no longer the frightened coalitions of 1805 or 1807. They had learned to coordinate. They had learned to endure. And they had learned that Napoleon, for all his genius, could be beaten if you refused to play by his rules. The final mistake was not charging at Waterloo. It was returning from Elba at all. Napoleon believed France still needed him. He believed Europe would fracture under restored monarchies. He believed his soldiers would follow him into one more war. Some of them did. But not enough. And not with the conviction that once made his armies unstoppable. The empire he tried to rebuild lasted 100 days. The legend he tried to restore was shattered on a muddy ridge in Belgium. And the man who once decided the fate of nations spent his final years on a rock in the ocean, still convinced he had been right all along. What remains is not a lesson about military strategy. It is a question about judgment. How do you know when your understanding of the world no longer matches the world itself? How do you recognize that the instincts that brought you success are now leading you toward failure? Napoleon never answered that question. He believed until the end that one more campaign, one more victory, one more roll of the dice would restore everything. He was wrong. And the cost of being wrong was permanent.